Hey everyone, welcome back. We are on lesson 5 today, and we are reading chapter 14 of Lunch Money. Aren't you guys loving this story? It's so awesome, right? Andrew Clements is a fantastic author. So let's go ahead and get started. We are going to our learning intentions. We are learning to identify key events so we can summarize a story. Keeping it nice and simple, right? So for our success criteria, we have to identify the key events, identify the main idea, and then put those together to summarize the story, right? So vocabulary, you have the word conceited. Ooh. So it says choosing his words carefully. He said, I don't want you to get all conceited or anything because your pictures, well, they're good. And you see in our picture here that we have this person, they're pretending to put on their crown. So conceited, what do you think it means? It is overly proud of oneself. So if you're really kind of like stuck up and stuck on yourself, like, I'm so amazing, someone might say, oh, you're being a little conceited there. So Greg doesn't want Mara to get conceited when he gives her a compliment. And then we have the word empire, and it makes me think of the game Monopoly. And today his whole comic book empire was crushed, and all that money was swirling down the drain. So empire, what do you think an empire is? It's a large commercial organization owned or controlled by one person or a group. So his comic book organization, remember, or comic book empire, remember, he is selling all these comics and making all this money, and it's owned by just him. So today you are going to be practicing vocabulary. So you're going to have a drag and drop activity on Seesaw, and you need to match each word to its definition. Let's go ahead and get to reading. We are going to read chapter 14 today, 75% of nothing. Wonder what they're going to be talking about. No lunch recess. It was the only thing Greg really hated about 6th grade. After the kids finished eating, they had to dump their trays, sit back down, and wait for the bell. No walking around, no loud talking. And Mr. Percy, the custodian, was always there, leaning on his map handle, watching. It reminded Greg of mealtime in an old prison movie. Mr. Percy was like the guard, always edgy until the prisoners were locked up in their cells again, except the convicts got to go out into the exercise yard every afternoon, and the 6th graders didn't. Greg had done some thinking since 3rd period, and he decided he ought to say something to Mara about her drawings. He hadn't actually lied to her in the hallway after social studies, but he had come close, and he remembered that hurt look she gave him as he'd shoved her pictures back in her face. Yes, Mara was annoying, and she was a copycat, and he was glad Mrs. Davenport had fixed it so they were going to see even less of her every day. Still, she had gone out of her way to ask his opinion about her drawings, and her excitement about comic books seemed real. So why not tell her the truth about her artwork? It was the least he could do, and besides, it wouldn't cost him anything now that he couldn't sell comics at school. Greg knew that if he went over and tried to talk to Mara at her table, he'd be surrounded by girls. No way could he say what he wanted to with an audience like that. Plus, with Mrs. Davenport's orders to keep away from Mara, he didn't dare just walk up to her. So he ate fast and watched carefully, and when Mara got up to take her tray to the drop-off window, Greg made his move. His timing had to be perfect. It was, but Mara saw him coming. As Greg slipped into the short line behind her, he saw her shoulders stiffen, so he talked fast, his voice low. That thing in the office went okay, don't you think? I mean, it stinks not being able to sell comics anymore, but at least we didn't get in trouble. Not even a detention. Pretty good, huh? Mara didn't turn, didn't nod, didn't react. Nothing. So Greg took a deep breath and said, Listen, I didn't mean what I said after social studies when Eileen and Brittany came up, but you heard what they said, and it just what? Mara hissed, still keeping her back to him. Did the big, mean girl scare you? You could have said something like, we're just talking, because you only made everything look worse, which is just what they wanted. Besides, who's stupid enough to even care what those two things? Oh, I forgot. You are. Ooh, spicy. Mara's really telling him how it is right there. But our focus question is, why does Greg decide to talk to Mara? Why did he do that? Let's think. Were you paying attention? Right? He kind of wants to make it right with Mara because he had told her how terrible her drawings were, and he noticed that it really hurt her feelings. So he wanted to kind of clear the air and straighten that up a little bit, especially now that they can't sell comics at school. He figures, well, she's not going to be competition for that anymore anyway. If Mara wanted to trade insults, she was messing with the wrong guy. Oh, yeah? Greg said, well, I'm what? Mara whipped around so fast that the empty milk carton flew off her tray. Greg had the words. He could have hit her hard, but that wasn't what he wanted. He took a breath. Again, Mara demanded, I'm what? You're right, Greg said. What I did was stupid, and what I said was stupid. So, I'm sorry. Then he bent down, picked up her milk carton, and tossed it into the recycling barrel along with his own. Oh, Mara said. She was surprised he'd apologized, and also that he'd picked up her trash. She said, thanks, and then slid her tray onto the conveyor belt. Greg said, you're welcome, and then he dumped his tray too. With his hands empty, Greg suddenly felt awkward. He missed having his red pencil case to hang on to. He stuffed his hands into his pockets. He said, so, don't you want to know what I was thinking of this morning? About your drawings before all that? Mara said, yeah, but only if you were going to say something good. And then she turned and walked toward the crowd of kids at the dessert table. Greg followed her, glad that the noise and talking in the cafeteria seemed to be getting a little louder. The sound was like camouflage. He edged up next to Mara and said, if you only want to know what was good, your drawings won't ever get better. She turned her head. So some of it was good? Really? Greg looked into her face to see if she was actually kidding. Her eyes didn't lie. Mara actually had no idea how brilliant her pictures were. It struck him like this might be the first time he had ever looked into Mara's face when they hadn't been yelling at each other. He turned his face forward and took a step closer to the dessert table. Choosing his words carefully, he said, I don't want you to get all conceited or anything. And there's that word conceited, remember? Because your pictures, well, they're good. Maybe it's just beginner's luck or something, but I don't think so, because you got it. The whole idea of how pictures work in a comic, the timing of the panels in the scene, you just nailed it. Greg sneaked a sideways look at Mara. Her cheek, usually pale next to her blonde hair, was flushed with color. She was smiling slightly, trying not to, but smiling. He said, there's more. Ready? Mara angled her head his way, but wouldn't look at him in the face. She nodded. He said, okay, some problems. You know what scale is in a drawing? Mara nodded, and Greg said, so tell me. She said, it's when you make sure things look like they're the right size compared to other things. Like if a unicorn looks like it's actually bigger than a tree, then the scale is messed up. Greg said, right, so in a couple of your panels the scale was wrong, but only in just a few. The truth is, they're amazing, just incredible. With something in her voice that sounded like fear, Mara said, you're not just saying this, right? Greg shook his head and said, no. Then he said, I mean, I'm not some big expert or anything, but I've seen a lot of comics, and I think your pictures are really good. Really. Without even looking Mara in the face, he could tell how much those few words meant to her, and it seemed like she actually cared about his opinion. It was scary to feel how much power that gave him, and suddenly Greg felt kind of responsible, like he wanted to help her. It was an entirely new feeling. But Greg didn't let himself get carried away. His business mind kicked in, and in a flash he saw a way to be sort of helpful, and also to possibly make a little money. So, he said, how'd you like to make your whole unicorn story over into a comic book? And then print some copies, and then try to sell them. Not at school, but there are other places. If you want to, I could help. And your comic could be one of the chunky comics. And if any of them sell, then you could even make some money, sharing the profits. And if you come up with more story ideas, you could make more and try and sell them. What do you think? It seemed like a decent idea to Greg, and a very generous offer. Without missing a beat, Mara said, how much money would I get? 40% of the profits on every copy sold. Just on your comics, not mine, Greg added, again, feeling generous. Mara shook her head. 75% for my own comics, and you don't get to tell me what my story should be about or anything. They both took a step closer to the dessert table. 50%, said Greg, and he thought, she's the bossiest, most annoying, 75%, Mara said, or else I'll just go ahead and figure out how to do it all by myself. Everything he did not like about Mara came crashing back into his mind, and Greg was tempted to shout, fine, go ahead and do it all yourself, you stupid, stubborn lump. But he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him get angry. Besides, they weren't going to sell many comics now, maybe none at all, and 75% of nothing is nothing. So Greg said, deal, 75%, but you have to buy me an ice cream sandwich right now. So let's stop and think. We need to summarize Greg's solution to the problem of Mara threatening this business. So How is he fixing this problem? So let's think about the most important ideas. So he's worried about Mara threatening his business, but now that they can't sell comics at school, he's going, oh, maybe not so much of a problem. So he's complimented her drawings, and now he's invited her to become part of his company. So now he's going to work together with him, because now, instead of him threatening his business, they're going to work together. So they're going to be in partnership. Very sly on Greg's part. Mara stepped up, laid 4 quarters on the dessert table, reached into the freezer, grabbed 2 ice cream sandwiches, and slapped one of them in Greg's hand. She looked him in the eye, cracked half a smile, and said, "Deal." 3 minutes later, as Greg sat at his regular table, enjoying the last gooey bites of his free ice cream sandwich, the speakers crackled and the PA chimes sounded. Silence settled over the cafeteria as Mrs. Davenport began to speak. Again, Greg thought of a prison movie. It was time for a few words from the warden. Good afternoon, boys and girls, and good afternoon also to all the teachers and staff. I'm sorry to interrupt classes this way, but I have an important all-school announcement. Some of our students have been making small comic books and bringing them to school. I have looked at some of these, and they are not the sort of thing we want here at Ashworth Intermediate School. Also, I have learned that some of these students have been selling these little comic books to their friends right here at school. Even if these comics were appropriate, and they are not, even then, no one would ever be permitted to sell them at school. Our town school committee has a strict policy about this. So please listen carefully. Starting right now, I want all students and all teachers to understand that these little comic books may not be brought to school, they may not be created at school, and they certainly may not be sold at school. Thank you all for your cooperation, and have a productive afternoon. The chocolate wafers were Greg's favorite part of an ice cream sandwich. And as he chewed the last sticky bits from his left thumb, he thought, so that's it. The warden has spoken. Chunky Comics is now officially dead. And suddenly, Greg was surprised, startled, almost shocked. Not that Chunky Comics was dead. He'd known that that was going to happen. What amazed him was that he wasn't more upset about it, because only yesterday he'd been shouting in Mara's face, all set to go Cro-Magnon on her because she was cutting into his profits. And today, his whole comic book empire was crushed, and all the money was swirling down the drain. And what was he doing about it? Eating ice cream. You see that word empire again. Remember his big company that he had this monopoly in. He owned all of it. And Greg thought, what's wrong with me? I should be furious. I should be pounding on this table shouting, unfair, unfair, unfair. But Greg didn't have a chance to think more deeply about this, because at that moment, the bell rang. Everyone stood up. Mr. Percy began barking orders, and the inmates at Ashworth Intermediate Security Facility started trudging back to their cells. So back to class they went. After math class on Friday afternoon, Greg rushed out and went straight to the art room. He needed every possible minute to work on his wire sculpture. Mara took her time leaving room 27, and as she got to the door, Mr. Z called, "Mara, just a quick word, please." She turned around, made her way through the other kids, and walked over to stand in front of his desk. Mr. Z started slowly. "I just wanted to say that I feel like what happened yesterday between you and Greg was partly my fault. When Greg started yelling, I should have pulled him right out into the hall. Then all that mess wouldn't have happened, and you wouldn't have been called to the principal's office today, or been switched out of my class. And by the way, that was not my idea. So I wanted to say I'm sorry, and I feel like I've turned you two into worse enemies than ever." Mara shook her head and said, "It's okay, really. Things are better now. I mean, it's not like Greg and I are friends or anything, but we're sort of in business. We've got a deal and everything, and I'm going to make comic books for Greg's company." Mr. Z's dark eyebrows went up. "Greg's company? Well, that's good news. Great." He smiled and didn't seem to know what to say next. "So," Mara said, "can I go now? I can't be late for language arts. Again." "Of course," Mr. Z nodded. "Go right ahead. And have a good weekend." "You too, Mr. Z." After Mara was already out the door, Mr. Z called, "And if you two want any advice, I know some economics and accounting and business stuff." Mara called back, "Thanks." Earlier, during lunchtime, Mara Shaw had listened to the announcement from the principal, and she had heard the same words Greg had heard. But for her, Chunky Comics wasn't dead. It was just coming to life. She intended to make Greg keep his word. He was going to help her turn the Lost Unicorn into a real comic book, whether he actually wanted to or not. And Mara couldn't wait to get started. So I wonder what Mara's got up her sleeve there. So, remember our learning intention today was to be able to summarize a story. So the first thing that we need to do in that first success criteria is to be able to identify key events. So we want to think, what key event happened at the very beginning of this chapter? So what is an important thing that happened at the beginning of the chapter? We're going to use a graphic organizer to help us summarize it. So the first key event, what happened at the beginning of the story, is that Greg had decided to remember to apologize to Mara. So in the cafeteria, he walks right up to Mara, and they get to apologizing and they get to talking. So that's the first thing that happened. And that's really important for our story, because if Greg hadn't decided to go up to Mara and apologize, the rest of the chapter would not have played out in the same way. So then we want to think, what key event takes place in the middle of the chapter? So, and another important thing that happens in the middle of the chapter, right? Greg offers to help Mara make comics. So that's the next thing that's important, is that he decides, you know what, I'll help you. And then lastly, we want to think about a key event that takes place at the end of the chapter. So what's something important that just happened right at the very end? Mara tells Mr. Z that she and Greg are going to the comic book business together, right? So when we are going to think about the main idea, we want to think about the main thing that happens in this chapter. So kind of putting these key details together to form the main idea. So when I do that, I say that Greg and Mara are going to make comics together. Because really that's the main thing that kind of happened in this chapter, is that they have now gone into business. When I summarize, I want to put together my main idea along with my key details into a couple of sentences. So when I'm summarizing, I want to tell what happened in the chapter, but I want to make it obviously much shorter than the chapter. So I'm going to leave that to you. You have your main idea and key details. And for your reading response today, which we'll get to in a second, you're actually going to get to summarize the chapter. So you're going to want to take this information and put it into a few short sentences. So let's get back to those learning intentions for today. We are learning to identify key events so we can summarize the story. We've done those things. We know we're successful when we can identify the key events. So we did that in the graphic organizer. Check. Identify the main idea. We also did that in the graphic organizer. Check. And then summarize the story. Now that's what you are going to show your ability on today. So are you going to get that check mark? I surely hope so. You have to show what you know on your reading response. So it says to summarize what has happened in chapter 14. And then I want you to also think, how does Greg go about solving his problem with Mara? And again, use those details from the text and use that graphic organizer that I already filled out for you. All right, that is all for today. I hope you have a wonderful day. Do all of your work, be kind to one another, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.